Okay, we are recording. This is Catherine Tunis at the EPA, and this is the Small Business Environmental Assistance Providers Technical Committee conference call. We are doing a series of presentations here from EPA related to oil and gas energy extraction. I will remind everyone, if you are on the phone, to please mute your phone unless if you are the presenter. Okay, our first presentation will be made by Jesse Pritts. He's an environmental engineer with EPA's Office of Water. Okay, you have his bio on the agenda, so I'm not going to read it. And Jesse, it's your turn.
All right, thanks everyone. Let me get the slide going here. So, all right, well, good afternoon, everyone, or maybe still good morning, depending on where you are. So, yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit today about some recent and ongoing projects we have here in the Office of Water related to oil and gas extraction, produced water management. So I just a little bit about me. I work in the Effluent Guidelines program. We do technology-based discharge standards for wastewater. If I can get the slides to advance here. There we go. Okay, so what I'd like to cover today is a little background. I'll talk about oil and gas produced water generation management, a little overview of some of our clean water regulations that affect oil and gas produced water, and then talk about 3 activities that we've either recently completed or are currently working on that that affect oil and gas produced water management. So just a little background on produced water in case you don't know what that is. So oil and gas extraction activities generate a variety of wastewaters. Those include drilling wastes and spent drilling fluids, which are byproducts of drilling the oil and gas wells into the formation. Hydraulic fracturing, if you know anything about that, it requires a lot of water to fracture rock formations to get the oil and gas to flow to the surface. A large portion of that water comes back to the surface after hydraulic fracturing. That's called flowback water. Produced water, which is water that's contained in the formation itself. So in addition to the rock formation containing oil and gas and other hydrocarbons, a lot of formations also contain water that has been there you know, for a very long time. That's called, we call that produced water. And there are various well maintenance activities that are done to continue production to make the wells continue to produce oil and gas. So those well maintenance activities can generate some waste as well. And just a little bit, you know, in terms of numbers, how much produced water is out there. The Groundwater Protection Council did a report that they just recently released earlier this year. And that report contains some numbers on produced water generation in the U.S. that were generated in 2012. So in 2012, there were nearly 1 million oil and gas wells in the United States, and those wells generated nearly 900 billion gallons of produced water. So it is quite a lot of water that's being produced from oil and gas extraction activities nationwide. And just of note, the GWPC is working on some updates on the 2012 numbers. So they're going to come out with an updated report, I think later this fall, that contains some updated numbers for more recent years. So why do we care about produced waters? Well, in addition to just the volume, those wastewaters contain a variety of pollutants that can be harmful if discharged to the environment. Those pollutants include salts, sodium chloride, hydrocarbons from the oil that's in the formation, a variety of other organic compounds that can be present either naturally or that are added during the hydraulic fracturing process. There's also some metals, and depending on the formation, there can be radioactivity in those produced waters as well. And one of the main concerns are salts, total dissolved solids. Some produced waters can have TDS ranges over 300,000 milligrams per liter. So quite a bit of salts and chlorides that can be present in produced waters, which can be of concern. So how do folks manage produced water? There's a variety of different practices that are currently available and are used for managing produced water. One of the primary means of managing that water is to reuse it in the oil field, either for what's called enhanced oil recovery or reuse in the hydraulic fracturing process itself. Some of the the wastewater is managed on site in pits or evaporation ponds. Some states allow produced water to be applied to roads for de-icing or dust suppression. There's also what's called beneficial reuse, where the produced water can be used for things like watering livestock or wildlife propagation in streams. There's also some produced water that's used right now to irrigate crops. And in some cases, although it's not prevalent, treatment and discharge to surface waters is used. And another primary means of disposing of it is what's called deep well injection. So we have a program for managing produced water into underground disposal wells. So on the right just shows some statistics, again, from this 2019 GWPC report. And you can see that enhanced oil recovery and use of disposal wells are the two primary means of managing produced water, the vast majority. Currently, very little of it is actually treated and discharged to surface waters. So a little quick background on Clean Water Act regulations. If you familiar at all with the NPDES program, it was created in the 1972 Clean Water Act, and it's our primary program for managing discharge of wastewater from industrial sources as well as from municipal wastewater treatment plants, what we call publicly owned treatment works, or POTWs, to surface waters. So if you want to discharge wastewater, you need to get an NPDES permit, either from EPA or the state, depending on who is delegated. And those NPDES permits contain two different components, a technology-based component, which is what my program works on, which is based on the performance of specific technologies, and a water quality component, which is developed based on state water quality standards. And those water quality standards can vary on different streams for different uses. So our program, our Effluent Guidelines program, we currently have two regulations that affect oil and gas wastewater management. The first is our Oil and Gas Extraction Effluent Guidelines, 40 CFR Part 435. The second are our Centralized Waste Treatment Effluent Guidelines. So a little bit of background on our Oil and Gas Extraction Effluent Guidelines. So right now, our national standards, our national technology-based standards, for onshore oil and gas extraction activities, it's what's called a zero discharge of pollutant standards. So producers cannot discharge treated produced water to waters of the United States or waters of the state. So they either must reuse that produced water, in their oil and gas operations, or dispose of it in underground disposal wells. Now, we do have an exception in western states west of the 98th meridian. We do allow discharge of produced water if it's of good enough quality and it has a use in agriculture or wildlife. So there are a number of producers in the western states that are currently discharging produced water. Recently, in 2016, we promulgated a rule, a pretreatment standard that applies to discharges of wastewater from unconventional wells to those municipal wastewater treatment plants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Our other rule are our Centralized Waste Treatment Effluent Guidelines. So these are off-site commercial facilities that manage wastewater, and right now there are a number of these facilities in the country that are managing oil and gas produced water. So even though the onshore oil and gas regulations are a zero discharge of pollutant standard, you can send your wastewater off-site to a commercial centralized waste treatment facility. So, so it is a way of managing your produced water that does involve a treatment and discharge to surface waters. However, when we developed those CWT rules, we didn't. There's no category for produced water, so those regulations weren't really developed with produced water in mind. There's a question about whether those regulations are adequate for managing produced water. So we actually recently completed a study looking at these facilities that treat produced waters. And I'll also talk a little bit more about that. So just a little more on our pretreatment standards that we did in 2016. There's, as I mentioned, there are a number of pollutants in produced water. And generally, our treatment technologies that are present at our municipal wastewater treatment plants are not designed to remove the pollutants that are in produced water. So what's going to happen if you send produced water with high levels of salts to a municipal wastewater treatment plant is those salts are just going to pass through the treatment plant and be discharged. And that can cause a number of problems downstream, specifically with pollutants like bromide. There are also some other impacts that produced water can do. It can hinder the performance of the biological treatment at the wastewater treatment plants, and it can also affect the biosolids. So we actually did a rule in 2016 that established a zero discharge of pollutant standard for these unconventional wells that prohibits them from sending their wastewater to POTWs. And that rule was effective as of August 29th last month, so that's a recent change. So starting last month, producers that were sending their wastewater to POTWs, and there were a number of those producers in Pennsylvania, they are no longer able to do that, so they must find another means of managing their produced water. Our centralized waste treatment study, this is a study that we completed last year, and this was focusing on these commercial facilities that treat produced water. What we were trying to do with this study is just sort of get a handle on how many facilities are out there that were treating produced water, what kind of technologies are they currently using, are there any documented impacts from these facilities? And again, it's similar to the municipal wastewater treatment plants. If these commercial facilities don't have the technologies in place to treat the pollutants that are in produced water, those pollutants are going to just pass through and be potentially discharged to the receiving stream. So we wanted to get a handle on whether we actually needed to update our regulations for these commercial facilities. So we completed that study, and what we decided at the time was, well, we're not going to make any changes right now to that regulation. Instead, we're going to sort of take a step back and do sort of a broader national look at produced water under the Clean Water Act. So we started what's called our National Produced Water Study. So the produced water study is really trying to understand how much produced water is being generated, how it's currently being managed, where sort of constraints might be popping up on produced water management activities. I mentioned a primary means of managing produced water is disposal in these underground injection wells. In some cases, in some states, those resources are becoming limited. If you're at all familiar with activities in Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico, you may have heard about some issues with underground injection potentially causing seismicity or earthquakes. So some of the states are taking a closer look at this disposal practice, and there's a potential that there may be constraints on using these injection wells in certain areas. So we wanted to take a look and see, well, are there other approaches for managing produced water? I mentioned that you can't treat and discharge produced water under our national regulations right now. Well, we wrote those regulations in 1978. Things have changed a bit since then. Particularly treatment technology has improved. The cost of treatment technology has come down. So in certain cases, it might actually be economical to treat this produced water and allow it to be discharged to surface water more broadly. And in addition, some states are really concerned about the availability of water resources. So we have all this produced water that's being put into these injection disposal wells. Maybe we can treat this water instead, renew it, and make it available for other sources, be that agriculture or industrial uses or cooling water, et cetera. So we wanted to sort of understand what was going on in the country right now to see if we potentially wanted to make some changes to our rules. So we went out, we talked to a lot of folks to try and see how produced water is being managed in the states right now. Look at some of these opportunities for reusing produced water, both inside and outside of the oil field. What types of treatment might need to be done to produce water to make it suitable for other uses or other applications, and sort of understand, what would people think about EPA changing our national regulations to allow broader treatment and discharge of oil and gas extraction produced water under the MPDES program. So really what we were trying to do was talk to folks and understand sort of where they were on this idea about renewing produced water, treating it to discharge to surface water. So we did a lot of outreach during 2018. We held over 80 meetings across the country with a variety of stakeholders, primarily focusing in the oil and gas producing states, so that we can talk with folks on the ground that are either working at the state or in industry, that we could get some insights on produced water management. And we also had a number of conference calls and webinars. So we tried to engage with academia, because they're doing a lot of research on treatment technologies and performance and environmental impacts of pollutants. We wanted to understand what work was going on there. industry because obviously they're the primary generators of produced water. So we wanted to understand where some of these constraints, might be popping up on their ability to manage the produced water. The NGO community has a big stake in this issue as well, the general public. And a primary focus was talking to the states, the state regulatory agencies and the state oil and gas permitting agencies, and some of the state agencies that deal with like agriculture and water availability and water supply. Also the tribes, a lot of oil and gas activities take place within or adjacent to tribal areas, and as well also treatment technology vendors. So we did that outreach. We put together a study. This isn't a typical study that EPA does that contains a lot of data and analysis. It's really what we call an outreach study. We really wanted to, talk to folks and get their thoughts and ideas on things that we might need to look at if we're going to potentially revise our regulations. So we published the draft study in May. We had a public input period that ended July 1st. And what we're working on right now is finalizing, preparing a final report that we plan to publish later this year. And either in that report or in a subsequent activity, we'll then identify what our next steps are going to be. Are we going to change our national regulations to allow broader discharge of produced water? Are we going to look at a regulation that's addressing these centralized waste treatment facilities, commercial facilities? Maybe there are non-regulatory approaches we can do to help promote more reuse of produced water, both inside and outside of the oil field. So that's really was the goal of the study. So a few links here, and we can distribute the slides after the end of the meeting today, so you can go and find the three things I talked about. So the first one is our pretreatment standards, what we call our unconventional oil and gas extraction effluent guidelines. The second one is the centralized waste treatment study, and the third is our draft oil and gas extraction produced water study. And that's the presentation. I ran through that pretty quick because I wanted to give at least a couple of minutes for some questions before we bring up our next presenter. So I'll pause there to see if there are any questions from anyone on the line.
I have muted everyone. If you'll have to unmute yourself or send a message via chat.
Okay. And we could also, if it's more efficient, we can compile questions and we can respond after the meeting. And also, you do have my contact information. Here you go. So feel free to email me or call if you've got any questions or want to chat or have any, anything you want to talk about our produced water efforts. All right, well, Catherine, I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, then thank you very much, Jesse. Our next speaker is Jeff Speir, and he will also be speaking with Tim Elkins. And Jeff is an attorney in OOOOa's Office of Civil Enforcement here in Washington. He works on water issues, and also Tim Elkins is an enforcement person in EPA Region 5, which is the Chicago area and surrounding states. So take it away, Jeff and Tim.
Thanks, Catherine. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me on the line?
Jeffrey, I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you, Jeff.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Catherine. As Catherine mentioned, I'm in the Office of Civil Enforcement within OOOOa, Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, and specifically in the Water Enforcement Division. So I wanted to speak a little bit this afternoon or morning for some of you on some of the enforcement and compliance issues that may pop up in this area. So starting out with underground injection control, as Jesse mentioned, the produced water that comes to the surface as a result of oil and natural gas production is primarily managed through underground injection control wells. I think the stats were, if I saw it correctly, 38.9% managed by disposal, and then another 45% managed by enhanced recovery. So I'll get into a little bit about what those two well classes are and about how many of them are in the United States and how they're regulated and what the compliance issues might be. But taking a step back, the Underground Injection Control Program is a part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. It is the sister to the Public Water Systems part. And the UIC part is designed to protect underground sources of drinking water from contamination and endangerment. And underground sources of drinking water is a defined term in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and contaminant is too. Endangerment is not, but that's something that the EPA bases a lot of enforcement actions and further considerations on interpretation of that term. So within the UIC program, there are 6 classes of wells, but I think relevant here really are the Class 2 wells. Those are the ones that are associated with oil and natural gas. So for the Class 2 wells, there's an estimated 2 billion gallons of fluid injected every day. And this happens at approximately 180,000 wells across the country. The two that came up in Jesse's presentation and that are most relevant within Class 2 wells are disposal and enhanced recovery. The Class 2 disposal wells make up approximately 20% of that 180,000 well figure. And basically what this is, it is self-explanatory. It is the disposal of the brines that are brought to the surface in connection with the oil and gas extraction after separation from the hydrocarbons at the surface. They're often reinjected into the same well that was used for production or similar underground formations. And I'll mention here, but to talk a little bit more about it in a second, wastewater that comes up, brines that come up from hydraulic fracturing activities can also be injected into Class 2 wells, though those hydraulic fracturing activities aren't necessarily regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So with that said, the second category of Class 2 wells are the enhanced oil recovery wells. And these make up close to 80% of the 180,000 that exist. So if you're keeping track of the two figures that I presented, that's almost 100% of the Class 2 wells are fit into these categories of disposal and enhanced recovery. So enhanced recovery wells operate by injecting brines or other waters into oil-bearing formations in an attempt to recover residual oil and sometimes natural gas that exists in that formation. The way this happens is the injected fluids decrease the viscosity of the hydrocarbon, displacing some of it and pushing it into another area where production well may be able to access it. So usually these exist with a single injection well and then multiple production wells that are able to draw from the hydrocarbons that are moved from the injection. And as I mentioned before, the UIC program, the Safe Drinking Water Act, does not directly regulate most hydraulic fracturing. The caveat is that when diesel fuels are used, it does fall into the ambit of the Safe Drinking Water Act. I'm sure you all know what hydraulic fracturing is, but this is when, sort of similar to the enhanced recovery process that I just described, the pressure is sufficient to crack an underground formation, allowing hydrocarbons that may exist within adjacent formations to flow to the surface. So some of the compliance requirements that are associated with underground injection control vary based on where you are. So there's 3 separate regimes. First, there's EPA direct implementation jurisdictions. And this, as it suggests, is where EPA regional offices directly oversee permitting, compliance, and enforcement at UIC wells. And these operators are required to follow the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 40, Parts 144 and 146. The second variety of compliance requirements will come via a state that has received primacy to implement the underground injection control program for Class 2. via 1422 of the statute. And in these jurisdictions, operators have to follow the requirements of the state, which should be the same as or close to the federal requirements, because for primacy for 1422, these states have to meet the minimum federal requirements that we promulgate by rule. The third variety of compliance and enforcement issues to keep an eye on for Class 2 only are state 1425 primacy jurisdictions, where a state has come in under a separate part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And these states have shown, in order to get the primacy, that their program is effective at preventing endangerment to underground sources of drinking water. So these requirements will vary a little bit more from the EPA direct implementation jurisdictions and the state 1422 primacy jurisdictions. But in some, I guess, especially in the two latter categories, all of the requirements are incorporated by reference in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 40, Part 147. So state by state, well class by well class, the applicable regulations and statutes by state are incorporated there. So I'll pause there and see if, Tim, if you want to add anything on UIC that I may have missed or misspoken.
You know, the only kind of things I just want to highlight on there is, you know, Jeff and Jess both, you know, pointed to how much volume of waste fluid is injected, you know, into Class 2 wells. And so, you know, Class 2 wells or injection wells are, you know, really important part here. And, you know, EPA thinks those, you know, are a safe method of disposal when they're properly constructed, operated, and monitored. And, you know, the monitoring aspect is something we focus on a lot in here in Region 5. So we certainly emphasize that in the compliance assistance we provide and, you know, inspections that we do. So for any Class 2 program, you know, we just, I think it's important to, you know, have those three things well constructed, appropriately, continue to operate in EPA limits, and then continuously monitor those.
Great, thanks, Tim. So I'll move on quickly just to discuss a couple other areas of water enforcement that might be relevant to oil and gas activity. First is Clean Water Act Wetlands Program. And then very basically, the Clean Water Act is designed to prohibit the unauthorized discharge of pollutants into waters of the U.S., and this includes dredge or fill material as pollutants. So this is typically where wetlands come into play under the Act. So this could come up in well siting and construction aspects of the operation, and if those two activities were to take place in a water of the United States, a permit would be required under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act that's generally issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or in two circumstances, the state, to authorize that activity, that is to make it not unauthorized. When issuing the permits, the Army Corps looks at practical alternatives and mitigation opportunities if there are no practical alternatives to the particular site in question. So the compliance issues here are a little more basic than for the Underground Injection Control Program, the Safe Drinking Water Act. They're basically associated with not getting or seeking or obtaining a permit to discharge dredge or fill material, or for failing to comply with the conditions of a permit that may have been issued by the Army Corps of Engineers or a state. This is generally a federal program, as I mentioned, but New Jersey and Michigan have assumed the federal 404 program via 404G, so their requirements would govern in those jurisdictions. The last area that I'll mention, also under the Clean Water Act, is SPCC, the Spill Prevention Control and Countermeasure Plan part. It's Clean Water Act Section 311, Title 40 of Code of Federal Regulations 112. And this sets forth requirements for prevention of oil discharges from reaching navigable waters or adjoining shorelines. So subject to certain capacity thresholds, facilities are to develop these SPCC plans to contain discharges of oil. And then pursuant to more recent but still dated 1990 amendments to the Clean Water Act, also facility response plans if there's a potential for substantial harm to the environment. So these SPCC plans have both general and facility-specific requirements. They take into consideration a lot of aspects of oil and gas exploration and production, including drainage, tank materials, secondary containment, blowout prevention devices, all the way down to record keeping and personnel training. This program, in contrast to the other two, is only federally implemented. So the compliance requirements that are associated with it will be in the Code of Federal Regulations and then in the Clean Water Act itself. So those are the three areas that I had intended to cover. I'm happy to answer questions or respond offline afterwards. But I'll hand it back to Catherine now. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, and we're right on schedule. Tim, did you want to add any last-minute thoughts?
You know, again, just as I mentioned, you know, we do a lot of inspections, mostly direct implementation here in Region 5, and a big part of our approach is sort of a boots on the ground campaign, providing compliance assistance in the field, going through permit requirements with operators. And, you know, for us, based on our observations, there's sort of a need to improve understanding or knowledge of EPA requirements. And so we focus a lot on individually permitted monitoring requirements, but then also try to work on sort of broader outreach as well. So that's just sort of our approach. We think we're seeing improvements, but an area certainly.
Great. Well, hopefully you can send a few people to the website, and hopefully they'll be able to provide assistance that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I choked in there for a minute. Just although you know we've had the boots on the ground campaign, we think the broader outreach will be really educational as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff and Tim. And next we're going to turn from water into the air. And Dan Hoyt, I think, cannot join us today, but Chris Williams is going to talk for about 15 minutes now about various air enforcement issues and kinds of problems that they're having or seeing in the different parts of the production process. So, Chris, are you on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Great.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you for having me here today to talk to you a little bit about air enforcement under the Clean Air Act. So we've listed here about 4 different items that I'll cover in this discussion. Maybe just a quick background, which I think folks are probably familiar with, but maybe helps to put what I'm about to talk about in a little context. So fractured wells produce primarily 3-phase flow with varying, varying constituents. And that 3-phase flow or mixture presents challenges in the storage, transportation, and processing of those, you know, hydrocarbon-heavy mixtures. And so we have focused on elements of that process from the actual production and storage of the 3-phase flow, which is water, gas, natural gas, and oil, to the gathering and transportation and boosting of that that mixture to the processing at gas processing plants. And so one of the areas that we've had a lot of enforcement activity is the storage vessels. A lot of times the three-phase flow enters the from the well, the facility, at a pressure, and then is stored at a lower pressure in atmospheric tanks. And the differential between the inlet pressure and then the storage pressure presents opportunity for flash emissions to occur. So the hydrocarbon, which comes in and it's very condensed, it's in a liquid phase, is then introduced into a lower pressure phase. And when that happens, some of the gas that's entrained in the fluid volatilizes, and capturing those vapors can be challenging and requires an intricate design. And so inspectors have gone to facilities with different tools, optical gas imaging, FLIR cameras, and photoionization detectors, and then, just visual observations, and have noted what we consider to be excess emissions from pressure relief devices that are placed on the capture, the vapor capture systems, for the purposes of making sure that the systems don't reach a pressure that would create an explosion. And in some cases, those pressure relief devices are emitting a significant amount of emissions. And so we've found that to be a problem that we've seen consistently throughout the country at various basins. And we are focused on investigating that issue. We've also identified a new owner audit program that we've recently put out to the public that allows for owners who have recently acquired assets that they believe have this issue to be able to come in and resolve the potential compliance problems and obtain penalty mitigation for their efforts. The link for the new owner audit is provided in the resources in the agenda that was sent around. I think a couple things to note is that there is a template agreement, and it clearly shows what the expectations are from both sides if someone chooses to enter into the agreement. And it has a technical appendix that identifies a process that a new owner would conduct in order to perform a comprehensive audit for the storage vessels. And the new owner audit is focused on production facilities, oil and natural gas production facilities. However, storage vessels and these issues we do see not just at the storage facilities, but also at gathering and boosting facilities, compressor stations, and at gas plants as well. So another area that we've focused on is leak detection and repair programs. There are requirements for operators to go out to their facilities and do their own inspections with different tools to find leaks and then repair them per the permit or whatever the requirements of their regs. And we've gone out and we've found that in some cases folks are complying with the requirements, but in other cases they're either doing the leak detection and repair program and not following through completely with all the requirements, or they're not performing leak detection and repair at all. And typically, those types of inspections are performed with some type of field evaluation where inspectors will do a comparative analysis and look at results that they've obtained versus the history of results that the facility has obtained, and note any discrepancies, but also a records review, which evaluates the procedure and makes sure the procedure that operators are following are in compliance with the requirements for the facility. And we've primarily focused that effort, at least in recent enforcement actions, at gas plants, where there's quite an extensive array of equipment that is required to be evaluated per the regulations and permits. Another area which we'll talk about is pigging operations. So in the transportation of the three-phase flow, there's a potential opportunity for liquid dropout while the hydrocarbon mixture is being transported, and that liquid can create unstable operating conditions for the pipeline operator. And so in order to move the liquids through the pipeline and help to maintain the pipeline, what a device which is called a pig, which is a polymer pill, essentially, gets inserted into the pipeline environment and sent through the pipeline and sweeps up the liquids and pushes them further downstream to a collection or liquid handling point. In order to do that, these pipelines are operating at high pressure. Certainly, in order to introduce the pig into the pipeline, the certain equipment which is operating at pipeline pressure needs to be depressurized, and then the pig is put into this equipment which is called a pig launcher, and then it's repressurized, and the pig then is sent along the pipeline where it's finally captured at a receiver. And when it's received, in order to extract the pig from the pipeline, the actual pig receiver also needs to be depressurized. And in many cases, or a lot of times, this depressurization, which essentially amounts to venting the gas that's in that equipment out of a stack, in a lot of cases into the atmosphere, can, depending on the volume of the equipment and the pressure and the quality of the gas that is in the pipeline, can result in a significant amount of emissions. In many cases, along with the storage vessels, these pigging emissions we're finding to be, in excess of what's permitted, or unauthorized by the permit. And in other cases, there are specific requirements on how folks are to design this equipment that we're seeing, at least specifically for the storage vessels, that we're seeing not being followed through on. And so in many cases, these are results of, I guess, design deficiencies and or I guess ineffective operation and maintenance programs. And so if you look at the resources below, underneath the compliance, I guess it's listed here in the agenda under compliance assistance resources. You can see that we have some enforcement alerts that cover storage vessels. We have enforcement alerts that cover leak detection and repair programs. And then there's a little bit on the new owner audit. And I'll have Catherine, hopefully, can get this to you. We recently just published an alert on pigging operations. So I'll have Catherine hopefully get that to folks here after the meeting.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Chris. Thank you so much. That's great. And yes, I was going to point out those LDAR and new owner storage vessels resources down there as well. I'm glad you did that. Okay, so our next speaker is Amy Hambrick, and Amy is works in the OAQPS of the Office of Air Quality, the Office of Air and Radiation, and she's in North Carolina. Am I correct? Amy?
Yes, hello.
And Amy is going to talk to us about the new air regulations and proposed amendments to what we call Quad O A. So, Amy, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so on the agenda, you'll note that there's two actions that were listed on the agenda. One was the new air regs recently proposed policy package, and then the second one was proposed amendments to Quad OA. I think that those might be two separate things that were listed on the agenda. So I did want to kind of touch on those two actions that EPA is taking to essentially amend 40 CFR Part 60 subpart Quad OA. I don't have any slides with me today, but if you looked at the meeting invite, you saw the compliance assistance resources on the oil and gas air pollution standards homepage. There's a link to regulatory actions, and those two actions are listed right from that link where you could access the fact sheets. All right, let's see. So first, I think it's helpful in order to understand what EPA has done in 2018 and 2019, just to go back for a couple minutes in history to identify what EPA initially established as a new source performance standard. So back in 2012, EPA had issued a new source performance standard under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, or commonly referred to as Quad O. That rule intended to reduce volatile organic compounds from certain new reconstructed and modified sources across the sector. Most of the VOC standards that Quad O regulated were in the production and processing segments of the sector, and in the transmission and storage segment of the sector, EPA did regulate only one piece of equipment, which was storage vessels. Fast forward to 2016, EPA promulgated an additional new source performance standard under Section 111, or commonly called Quad O little a. That rule intended to cover what was essentially covered in 2012, but it also expanded the source category and expanded what pieces of equipment were regulated, and expanded into also covering not just VOCs, but also greenhouse gases in the form of limitations on methane from a broader set of sources across the sector, which included, again, the production, processing, and transmission and storage segments of the industry. In 2017, EPA had announced two actions. One was we granted reconsideration on technical requirements and implementation challenges of the Quad OA rule from 2016. And EPA initiated a policy review of the 2016 Quad OA rule as mandated by the March 28th, 2017 President's Executive Order for Energy Independence. In 2018, in October, EPA proposed technical amendments for that technical reconsideration. And I think that was proposed in October of 2018. And those specific technical amendments specifically addressed the fugitive emission requirements in the rule, It specifically looked at the alternative means of emission limitation under the rule for both emerging technologies and also state and tribal programs. It specifically looked at the requirements for storage vessels, LDAR and natural gas processing plants, and some, I guess, smaller requirements under pneumatic pumps and well completions, where we had identified those implementation challenges that we were trying to smooth out. So with those proposed technical amendments, specifically the fugitives area is always a hot button issue that folks are interested in. EPA had proposed changes to the monitoring frequency for well sites and compressor stations, and proposed how the repair requirements are set up in the rule, looking at that first attempt of repair within a certain time frame, and proposing to identify a final like stopgap for when that repair needs to be completed. So let's see. With those technical amendments, that comment period closed, and EPA is now working on a final rule to finalize those technical amendments. So separate from the technical reconsideration and getting that finalized, that is actually tweaking the standards themselves from Quad OA. I mentioned back, EPA had, in 2017 had initiated a review of Quad OA as mandated by the President's executive order. So I'm going to shift to talk a little bit now about the review. So the review, we've called it like the policy review, because we're essentially looking at how EPA has established the source category and how EPA had gone about regulating the source category in 2012 and 2016, and how EPA had looked at regulating specific pollutants. In 2012, we had expanded it from VOCs to also greenhouse gases in the form of methane limitations. So we look at Clean Air Act Section 111, and Clean Air Act directs EPA to establish standards for stationary sources of air pollution that may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. And the Section 111 requires EPA to set NSPS for those categories of facilities that EPA determines to significantly contribute. So what that specifically means for the oil and gas sector is that in 1979, EPA had established an original source category listing the oil and natural gas industry that only included the production and processing segments. In 2012 and 2016, EPA interpreted the source category to also include the transmission and storage segment. So for our action that EPA's administrator signed on August 28th for our policy amendments to Quad OA, EPA is proposing to, based on the the response to the executive order, EPA is proposing in a primary proposal to remove the transmission and storage segment from the source category, and propose to rescind methane as a regulated pollutant from the production and processing source segment of that source category. In an alternative proposal, EPA is proposing to keep the source category together and just rescind the methane standards from all sources without revising the source category. Part of this policy proposal, EPA additionally is seeking comment on an alternative interpretation of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, and the comments that we're soliciting are specifically in regards to, under Section 111, how EPA goes about making that significant contribution finding in order to regulate specific pollutants and regulate in how EPA looks at the source categories, and when we expanded the source category. So we're taking comments on all aspects of the proposal, notably that alternative interpretation of Section 111. With the proposed removal of methane as a regulated pollutant, this would remove EPA's obligation under the Act to regulate methane from existing sources. VOCs don't qualify as the type of pollutant that would trigger the application for the existing source standards. Let's see, so as you could probably tell, this policy proposal is a little bit of a different type of action. It's not necessarily amending the standards themselves like the technical amendments proposed to do that we're working now to finalize. Whereas those technical amendments I mentioned, they're really looking at changing monitoring frequency for fugitives and certain pump requirements. Really the nitty-gritty of how the standards are established. This action is really like a higher level of how EPA looks at the source category, how EPA is regulating the pollutants, and what pollutants we're regulating under the Clean Air Act. So like I mentioned, the administrator signed this policy proposal in late August. It is not yet published in the Federal Register. We are hoping that it is going to be published soon. Upon publication of the proposal in the Federal Register, that will open up a 60-day public comment period and a public hearing. We do plan to hold a public hearing, and that will be announced shortly as well. So we do look forward to engaging with all stakeholders on this proposed action, and we look forward to receiving all the comments on this unique action. It's a legally heavy read, and we do take various comments on EPA's legal interpretation. So we are looking forward to receiving that engagement. So that's a lot of information, a very high-level overview of what's going on with Quad OA in those two actions. I'm happy to take any comments if folks have any questions at this time.
Thank you, Amy. This is Catherine. That was a great summary, and I would ask if you also would notify us in the group, or if you notify me, I can send it out to the group of when that policy package is published, so that when the public comment period begins, and because I think there will be a lot of interest in this, and then also when the public hearing will be.
Absolutely, I will be sure to keep you guys appraised of that update when it's published and when the public hearing is going to be.
It would be great. Any other questions? We have about 2 minutes left.
This is Amy again. I will note from the website that I mentioned at the beginning, right from the meeting invite in our reg action page. Right now on the website for the policy package, folks can access a pre-publication version of the rule, the preamble and the rule. So you can, read it as it was signed. The regulatory impact analysis is also on the website right now, and that touches on EPA's estimated cost savings and foregone emission reductions. So essentially the emissions that would not occur with the rescission of the proposed rescission of the transmission and storage segment. And we also have a fact sheet that presents that high-level overview as well. So those resources are out there, in lieu of the docket being open. But folks are always welcome to reach out to me if you have questions or are having a hard time finding a copy of those documents. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, I want to thank everyone. This is Mark Stoddard. I want to thank everyone, Catherine, Jesse, Jeff, and Tim, and Chris, and Amy. You did a very good job. Donovan, are you on the line?
Yes, Mark.
You have any parting words?
Not especially. Certainly appreciate Catherine and the EPA team presenting on this topic. Next session will be October the 15th with Caitlin Urso from Colorado presenting on CBD, oils extraction, and their best management practices. Beyond that, that should be it.